I came up with the basis of my timeline theory almost 5 years ago. But I believe that theories shouldn't just be wishful thinking, but rather be based on solid arguments and logical thinking. So I was very excited to see clues in Breath of the Wild that point towards my idea. In fact, I think it's the only logical explanation for what we've seen so far. You're watching Zelda Pod Smashers. To present my theory, I'm going to go through the following points. Why do I believe in this? What is the theory? Why don't some people like it, and what's my response to their arguments? And then, how will Nintendo implement it? First of all, I have to mention that I don't see any reason to believe that the Link from this game is a Link from an older Zelda game. Yes, the voice tells Link to let his light shine again, and she begs Link to remember what happened 100 years ago. But every Zelda game comes with a backstory. In The Wind Waker you had the Legend of the Flood. In Twilight Princess you had the Interloper War and the Twilight Realm. In Skyward Sword you had the war between Hylia and Demise, etc. So if Breath of the Wild says that Ganon appeared 100 years ago and that Link has been asleep since then, it doesn't mean the story talks about another game. It probably is a new backstory. Besides, the story doesn't seem to fit any of the other Zelda games. Nintendo has said that the fun of the game is trying to figure out what happened 100 years ago. So that's how I think this backstory will work. Another reason that I don't think this is an old Link, or that it is a direct sequel to any Zelda game, is that it would chain the new game to one specific old game. Imagine it's going to be a direct sequel to Twilight Princess. But The Wind Waker was your favorite game, so that's a bit disappointing. Or imagine that it's linked to Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past. That's nice for a few veterans among us, but a whole new generation of gamers wouldn't feel anything special. And fitting it in between two games feels a bit wrong for such a new and huge world. To me, this game feels bigger than the previous Zeldas, definitely bigger than a direct sequel to just one of them. It's a totally new direction for Zelda, and I'm expecting a fresh start for the story as well. But we also notice a lot of references to older Zeldas. In fact, there have been so many specific throwbacks to previous games that people have been pretty sure about some of their timeline theories. Nintendo is doing a great job of confusing their die-hard fans and theorists. Because it's important to our timeline placement, let's quickly go through those points again. From Skyward Sword we have the goddess statues, we have a right-handed Link, and we have the scabbard of the Master Sword. From Ocarina of Time, the Sheikah Eye, the Temple of Time and its surrounding terrain. From A Link to the Past, we have the Master Sword pedestal. From the original Legend of Zelda, we have Twin Peaks, we have Spectacle Rock, and less profound are the Old Man and the Raft. From Twilight Princess, we have the Fountain of Castletown, we have the Great Bridge of Hylia, and we have Wolf Link. And then from The Wind Waker, we have the Blue Outfit, we have the Koroks, and we have the Ancient Sea Salt. Now, I do think that all theorists should consider the possibility that these things are just fun references, simple Easter eggs. Remember that at one point, this game was going to come out at the 30th anniversary of Zelda. Skyward Sword marked the 25th anniversary and had tons of references to the old games. I bet they didn't mind doing the same thing for Breath of the Wild. Anything to fill such a huge world is more than welcome. But would there be any canon way of fitting all these elements into a place on the timeline? What we've seen seems to point in several directions. Theories have been all over the place, a sequel to The Wind Waker or to Ocarina of Time, a prequel to A Link to the Past, and more recently a Twilight Princess sequel. Couldn't anyone just have asked Aonuma about the timeline placement? Well, actually, someone did. His answer? He pointed to his t-shirt. He stressed the Sheikah symbol and noted how it is the same as in Ocarina of Time. While I was looking at the timeline and this symbol, Suddenly it dawned on me. Boom. Timeline Unification. Breath of the Wild as the sequel to all sequels. The game that revolutionizes not just the Zelda gameplay, but also the timeline. It's the reboot that still fits into the timeline. Now suddenly all these elements from conflicting timelines make sense. Some people have speculated that this scene is a reimagining of the creation of the world. What if it's not the creation, but the recreation of Hyrule? And have you ever wondered why Ganon now has the prefix the Calamity? What if the timeline merge brought together 3 Ganons from different timelines? And now they have to use titles to keep them apart. Perhaps there's also the Warlord Ganon and the Deceiver Ganon or something like that. Is that why Link couldn't defeat Ganon 100 years earlier? And could that be why Ganon is said to appear suddenly? Then Aonuma would have pointed out that the Sheikah symbol is the same as in Ocarina of Time, because Ocarina of Time caused the original triple split. Now the Sheikah Eye symbolizes how the timelines are unified again in one game. These circles and lines around the Sheikah Eye could stand for the different games and their place on the timeline. Since E3, I have been one of the biggest advertisers of this theory on the Zelda Universe forums. My fellow Podsmasher Frank has been explaining this theory on his Hyrule blog. Only months later, some big YouTube channels ran with the theory and made their own videos about it. Similar ideas had been around before we came up with it, but now there are multiple names for the theory. Time Crash, Convergence, or Dragon Break, which is a term from the Elder Scrolls games. But I still have a lot of arguments to add for this theory. So far I have explained the why and the what. Before I go into how this could work, I want to talk a bit about why not. Why don't people like this idea? I have seen 3 major complaints about this unification theory. 1. People say it's impossible. 2. They say merging the timeline will limit Nintendo's possibilities for future placements. And 3. They think Nintendo wouldn't be so drastic. I'll quickly go through them one by one. The first thing people point out about this theory is that unifying multiple timelines seems impossible. We can barely wrap our head around a timeline split, where something happens that causes 2 or more different futures. But how would these timelines be merged into one again? How would that work? I'd like to point out that as far as we know, all time travel is impossible. We like to use it in our fiction, but it's still all fiction. So if we made up time splits, why not timeline unification? And story-wise, I would explain this by the 3 goddesses being above time and space, so also being above the timeline split. They would have the power to unify time again, but more about that later. The second problem that fans see is how it could limit Nintendo in their timeline placement for future games. Right now, Nintendo has 3 timelines that aren't finished yet. Zelda fans like the idea of new games being placed in one of the 3 timelines, and they think that a unification would prevent this. But Nintendo would still be able to place games anywhere they want. Some theories right now even place Breath of the Wild between 2 existing games. With a unification, Nintendo won't replace the old timelines, they would add one. So it's more options, not less. And remember that other franchises have just one timeline, and it's working pretty well for them. Besides, how often did Nintendo really place a new game at the end of the timeline? Most recent games have been prequels or fit in between 2 older games. The third thing people say is that Nintendo wouldn't be radical enough for a timeline unification. But when has Nintendo shied away from big plot twists? They flooded the whole of Hyrule just so they could let you sail on an ocean in the Wind Waker. And then for Spirit Tracks, they created a whole new Hyrule, so they could let you play on land again. Skyward Sword brought new origin stories for Zelda, Ganondorf, Link and a Master Sword. And they came up with the whole split timeline just 5 years ago, let's not forget that. Suddenly, a unification doesn't sound all too crazy, does it? You now know the basic concept of the theory, but how could Nintendo implement unification? Perhaps they'll keep things simple by not giving too many details about how the merge happened. It would be like the start of the Downfall timeline. Link got defeated in Ocarina of Time. Yeah, but how and why? Stop asking, Link got defeated and later the timelines were merged. As you can hear, I'm expecting a bit more. What I envision is the original 3 goddesses being unhappy about the time split. If the goddesses created the world, they're probably above time, right? So they see the split and see how Hyrule struggles. They grab all 3 timelines and use them to build a new Hyrule. And that is the Hyrule we're seeing in Breath of the Wild. They could take all the people, all the villages, the dungeons, the landmarks, and put that into a new land. With some cherry picking from the timelines, it would explain why the Twin Peaks were never showed in any game beside the original, but are prominently featured in this new Hyrule. It could be the reason the Koroks are here, but not a huge ocean covering all the land. Basically, Nintendo could pick whatever they want and say that it was the goddesses who picked it. But if you have people from multiple timelines thrown together, what will their history books look like? It could work if all inhabitants of this new Hyrule know that there were several timelines and that there are alternative histories. The Rito would know that they evolved from the Zora, even though the Zora are back again from another timeline branch. But how are the Sheikah related to all of this, other than the eye symbolizing the merge? Well, time travel. The Sheikah have usually been involved with time travel since they were introduced in Ocarina of Time. In Skyward Sword, Impa seems to be the only one who could activate the ancient time portals. Even in Breath of the Wild, the Sheikah monks seem to defy time by still being alive. So perhaps the Sheikah, as instruments of the goddesses, worked hard in different timelines to prepare the unification. For the last part of this theory, let's talk a bit about villages. At E3, Bill Trinen has said the villages and towns in the game would reveal too much about the story. Aonuma also didn't want to talk about the villages, because how they work is interconnected to the story and overworld. By now we've seen one village and it doesn't seem to reveal much about the story. Then why are they so reluctant to show the other ones? What if most of the villages in Breath of the Wild are actually taken from the games of other timelines? It looks like we may have already seen Twilight Princess's Castle Town. But what about Kakariko Village or Snow Peak Ruins? Or maybe that island here in the sea is actually Windfall Island? Or do you maybe want to see some towns from The Adventure of Link? If Nintendo goes for this, they obviously didn't want to show the villages yet, because it would be a huge spoiler. It would be a great excuse to put fan-favorite locations in this game. So there you have it, our Breath of the Wild timeline theory, the unification. It's controversial, it's complicated, it might sound silly to some, but it could be so epic. And it would give Nintendo tons of creative freedom. It's an anything goes solution, which can be used to put in all the throwbacks that Nintendo wants. And it would explain everything we've seen so far. By now, I'm hoping that Nintendo won't tell us the timeline placement in advance. I'm looking forward to discovering it while playing the game. And I'll be super hyped if I find out there is some kind of unification. If you want to read a bit more about the theory, use the link to Frank's blog in the description below. Next Friday you can expect a new weekly analysis. Until then, let us know what you think, and thanks for watching Zelda Pod Smashers.